Good evening and welcome to another program. This time we deal with the National Planning Commission, which has raised something of particular interest. Everybody in South Africa knows that it was a miracle how we got from apartheid through into a constitutional democracy. But the real question is, how do we get further? The National Planning Commission has put up a vision for where we could be in 2030. It's particularly appropriate for us to discuss this in this program, which deals with constitutional matters, because, in fact, towards the end of the report, they say the starting point for a new South Africa which would implement that vision of 2030, is the Constitution. And it's about that particular vision and how we implement it and the leadership that will get us there that we want to dwell on this evening. Now, with me in the studio, I have the chairperson of the National Planning Commission, Minister Trevor Manuel, Archbishop Ketan, Reverend Thabo Makgoba, and Dr. Louise van Rhyn from Symphonia. Can I start with you, Minister? I read here, I mean, it's very moving when you say, therefore, in 2030, we experience daily how, and you set out a whole series of objectives. We feel loved, we feel respected, we feel understood, we feel healthy, we play, we worship, we laugh together, we feel informed, we feel accommodated. This is about a vision of a South African community. And I really, maybe not me, because I try to be optimistic, but I would reckon that people watching this program would say, well, that's not where we are today. There's far too much anger, too much division, too much resentment, too much non-redress of our historical past. How do we get there?
Well,
I may be wrong about that, and you're perfectly welcome to tell me that, but that's my sense of that if I listen to talk shows, listen to people.
You know, when we were involved in the transition, many people thought that the values that we have in the Constitution, take the preamble and take the Bill of Rights, that would have been unattainable given where the country was. Now, when we crafted the National Development Plan, we asked two writers, Njabula Ndebele and Anki Kroh, to step out of the day-to-day decisions and the myriad of issues and begin to answer where we might be. And they've done this wonderful exercise, which is kind of projecting into the future. And it's a kind of touchstone, because the question is, are we capable of being that nation? And in reading the text as you do, there's that sense. And if you fervently appreciate the fact that we can get there, the question is how and what we have to give up.
Yes.
And so the issues in the plan are about what we give up, and then I think the question is what impels all of us as a nation to get there, because it's not going to automate. It needs a set of decisive actions, and that's what we need to talk about to each other.
See, but can I just ask you this? I mean, I accept that it's completely hagiographic, with all great respect to Mr. Mandela, who played this extraordinary role, to simply see that he was Moses who led us into the promised land, and the millions of people who struggled for democracy were completely irrelevant. I mean, that's complete nonsense. But the fact was, there was leadership from him and others, which got us through that awful time. And, I mean, clearly, we need that again, surely.
I think you need it, not again, but you need it continuously.
Okay, good point.
And I want to make the point that leadership is actually different from authority. It's not a position you occupy, it's behavior. And you can look at Madiba and his influence over people. I was saying to the Archbishop that Madiba used to say to somebody like myself, boy, you're thinking with your blood, not your brain. And it's very important, because you know, the ability of leaders is the ability to influence, to persuade, to correct. And you know, all of these things happened long before he became President of the Republic. In fact, much of what it did on the island and persuaded other people coming through the system was not when he was even President of the ANC. And so it's focusing on behavior and the ability to influence. And the more people think of a kind of big man notion of leadership, the less people see themselves in the equation. And that, I think, is what we need to talk about.
Archbishop, can I ask you that? Well, let me start again where I started with Mr. I take his point. I mean, you obviously, you know, lead a significant percentage of a religious community. Now, you must, your own flock, must express anger, frustration, despair from time to time. Or am I wrong about that? Should I be, I mean, in other words, is there a greater sense of optimism at present? Because there sure as goodness is if we get to where they suggest that's the National Planning Commission by 2030.
Yes. I think there are different stages in this sea of arriving at 2030, and some are quite excited about the pockets of excellence that are being achieved. Where my home is in Pimville, and so we never used to have a tarred road. So there is a tarred road. So there is a degree of excitement. But there are places like where I worked in the Eastern Cape, where I'm still very concerned about the mud schools and some of the challenges there. So there's a wealth of emotions around the issues in South Africa. But you're right, like the Minister said, we need bold, courageous leadership that will not be really trapped with some of these issues that are on the surface, but will go down deep into what really matters for South Africans.
But I'm sorry to be biblical for a moment. I tread cautiously. It's not Moses then in the form of Mr. Mandela. In fact, what the minister's saying is that somehow this empowers people. It's a broader leadership we're talking about.
I think you're right. Perhaps we should look at moral leadership. And I know when I say moral leadership, people go back to the Bible and look at the Old Testament and just recite those thou shalt do this or not. But I'm talking about a value-laden leadership that has a sense of urgency and a sense of what is right or wrong. A leadership that will say we need to serve rather than to empower our own pockets, so to speak.
All right. Well, I'll come back to that. I need to take a break and then we'll be back. Welcome back. Dr. Let me ask you the same question. I mean, leadership is clearly, therefore, not just a question of finding somebody. Not that there aren't people, but it's not. Why do I get the impression that we're always looking for one person who's going to lead us there, rather than, in a sense, something broader? Why are we so passive? We weren't always so passive.
Exactly. And I think that's the sadness about what happened since 1994, and it is an opportunity because it asks of us as South African citizens to say, this is my country, my future, and I'm not going to sit back and wait any longer for Superman or some miraculous person who's going to come and lead us, Moses. It's about what I do day to day, and my commitment as a citizen and our commitment as citizens to say, what can we do to create that future? Because it is a beautiful, beautiful vision. And it's one of those, we all need to have that vision.
Mean? I mean, somebody listening says, yes, fine, but what does that mean for me?
It means that instead of sitting around complaining about education, for example.
Yes, let's take that.
Let's take education. Instead of sitting around complaining, is to go and make myself available, not just my money, but my skills and my experience. We have millions of people in this country who have had the benefit of living in this country and are educated and are now sitting in their corporate offices in corporate South Africa and waiting for someone else to deal with the issue rather than making themselves available. And so it's about all of us making our skills and talents and contribution available and going to help and not sit and criticize and judge from the outside, because it's not going to get us anywhere. There's no benefit for that in that.
So why have we lost that militancy?
In many ways, I mean, the Archbishop and I certainly come from the mass democratic movement tradition, where struggles were part of what we did every single day. And we couldn't, I mean, the apartheid had entrenched itself in society as a force over everything. And democracy came as a consequence of these many struggles led by little people who assumed leadership responsibilities, replete with all of the risks. And then when democracy came and we elected people to go and sit in parliament, there was a sense of, well, it's over, we can outsource our responsibilities. And I think that what the National Planning Commission is arguing for is for people to be involved differently, so that each one of us as South Africans understands, as Louise says, we can't outsource our responsibilities. In fact, the privileges that many of us have in South Africa should compel us to give voluntarily of our time, because that's how you're going to close the gap.
All right, but let me put you on one thing. just picking up. The one amazing thing about the mass democratic movement, and I'm speaking now from my own background in that, as a white person if I can, nobody ever regarded me as white or black or pink when I was there. They thought, I'm on the right side here, I'm with you, and therefore I'm embraced. I get the feeling now we've lost that inclusiveness that we used to have. Now maybe that's the fault of people who sat in their corporate boxes and moaned, I don't know, but that's the sense I get, and there's a need for leadership there too.
There clearly is a need for leadership. I think on the one hand, the equity provisions in the Bill of Rights require us to act correctly. But I think that it's important to recognize that the counteraction is in fact a culture of entitlement. And it's, you see, it's about values, and the Archbishop is correct. It's about values and values and ethical standards that drive leaders. If apartheid, you know, apartheid wasn't wrong because it was white people doing it to us. Apartheid was wrong because the values were wrong.
Yeah.
And so you can't supplant one group of people with another. It's about getting the values right, getting equity and participation structured differently, so that all of us feel that we have a stake in what happens in this country. And that's, I think, the shift that's missing here.
Yes, sir, please.
And I think that the critical thing is that many people who have been, who've felt excluded from the process need to be invited back in. So that's the leadership role, is to create that invitation. We find that when we create opportunities...
When you talk about excluded, I want to probe you there as to who you're talking about.
So for a long time, I had a story about I have no role to play, I'm a white woman, I don't have a sense of belonging anymore in this country. I came back from the UK, didn't know how to find my place. It took me 6 years to find my place. But what I realized is that my story about me being a white person and I had no role was my stuff. There wasn't anybody else giving me that stuff.
Okay.
But I was carrying that around, and that was stopping me from making a contribution. And it was a choice that I had to make, to say, I'm going to make myself available for a different kind of involvement. And I started to work with principals on the Cape Flats, and my life changed. It was one of, and it remains one of the most amazing, life-changing experience for me to be in community with people who I wouldn't normally spend my time with. And I've realized that's the point, is we need to create those opportunities for people. Give them the opportunity to work with people other than the people who they normally spend their time with. Discover the joy and the beauty of our democracy and our diversity. But it's not something that happens automatically. That's the leadership role, is to create those opportunities, is to make it possible.
Can I just ask, I know you want to say something, but I wonder if you just take on board the following.
Yes.
I'm anxious that there shouldn't be just a question that sort of privileged people who basically, because of the past, are white people, as much as I think that they've got to do a whole lot more than they're doing. But millions of black people are also disempowered because of their poverty. You don't become an active citizen when you literally have a roof over your head. And I'm anxious as to how we deal with that too.
I think that's an important point. I mean, I've been working alongside the people of Makaza in terms of the sanitation and water problem through the Social Justice Coalition. And what I've learned there is people there said, Archbishop, don't speak for us, walk alongside us, so that we are able to articulate our position. And where we struggle to articulate it, you have felt and you have smelt the stench of Makaza, then you can put it in your own words. And we have a backlog in South Africa, but we need to create an enabling environment such that those wonderful entrepreneurs in Khayelitsha can actually be promoted. Because if you just drive down to Khayelitsha, I mean, you see the vegetables that they sell, you see the doors or the door frames and the rest of those. So we've got skills here. It's a question of how do we measure and tap that skill and bring those that are in the margin into the center.
Because otherwise they're not going to be active. They can't be, because it's much harder when you're actually... Mind you, I'm not sure about that. People who really were... as the Minister will tell me that there were people who were very, very poor during apartheid, and they were on the barricades day in and day out.
I grew up in Alex, and poverty didn't make me to
be a passive.
To be a passive. I said, I'm going to speak out and speak up because I have a vision of a better Alexander Township.
Well, I want to talk about that in a moment, but I have to take a break quickly. Minister, I wonder if I could put something to you in relation to the vision that you set out when you talk about your report talks about a sense of inclusiveness that touches all South Africans, including the poor, increased interaction between South Africans from different social and racial groups, mobilised active and responsible citizenry, broad-based knowledge and support for a set of values, particularly the inclusiveness part. I'm just worried that we're getting an overlay of race and class in this country, that there's some people who are very rich, vast majority are very poor, and in a sense you can't have inclusiveness then. And that there's a sense of value here. What kind of values do we really want to promote from the top down?
I think that in many ways values are shared, and values have to come from leadership, and they're about ethical values. They're about the sense that leadership, people who rise through the ranks, actually don't get caught up in corruption and bad practices, so that everybody understands that whilst even if there's material difference between one and the other, we're working together to ensure that those gaps are not large gaps. They're very difficult to manage everywhere in the world right now, but I think the Chinese talk about the need to construct a harmonious society. What are the elements of harmony that we need in South Africa? And they go back to the values that ought to define us, and our values are about interrelationship and mutual respect. But it's in the conduct, and that conduct is present in how we manage things, how we manage the resources that we have to look after, how we manage time, how we manage people, how we manage issues like respect. And people learn. It's more than just the authority of office. So I'm saying it's behavior, and that those interactions are shaped by the way in which we conduct
So I can't help but ask you this. I mean, people watching this program will say, yeah, absolutely right. And that, why do we open up our newspapers every day and hear more stories about corruption? They may be true, they may not be true, but it seems to be crowding out this kind of debate. We're having a debate about whether we should put people behind bars rather than a debate about a mobilised, active and responsible citizenry.
You see, I fervently believe that leadership must step up and be seen. And it's not just people in political office. I think across the board, all of us have a responsibility to deal with these issues very differently. And we who hold political office must understand that we don't have an exclusive preserve. We must understand that leadership everywhere is a risky business, that people criticize you, and that happens. And the more you conduct yourself in a way where you invite criticism, the more it's going to happen. But in a democracy, leaders are people who are criticized. It's par for the course. I don't think that...
Provided I accept that it's a principled criticism and not an ad hominem one, but that's the point I wanted to ask you is, we have an extraordinarily beautifully written constitution, and in fact if we could implement those values, I suspect we'd have utopia. The real question is, how do we assimilate those? In other words, how does that get internalized in our society, for the leaders downwards?
Yes, I mean, one of the beautiful...
I mean, you know precisely what I'm talking about. Every day you open up your newspapers and that's all we hear.
Exactly. I mean, I was pained, reduced to tears, with this recent rape of
the rape, exactly.
Of a child who's learning disabled. Not sort of physically disabled, but equally it's when powerful people who are tried for corruption, and then the next thing, then the charges are dropped, and then life continues. So that creates a lot of tension. But I mean, I want to go back to the recommendation that the National Planning Commission has made on page 436, saying 436, that quoting the preamble, that maybe we should encourage every child at school to learn the preamble off by heart. And I've got a copy here, but each time when I read that preamble, I think there's a lot here, that resonates with people of faith and people of no faith. And if we could start there at schools and say, know your preamble, so that if any South African child says, I pledge the preamble, and then they can start living it and say, now what do you mean addressing the injustice of the past? What are some of the injustices in your own context, and how can you deal with those? And maybe just working through that And it could lay a wonderful foundation for South Africa.
Well, it's true, because if you look at the United States of America with all its faults,
Yes.
kids there know their Bill of Rights.
Exactly.
They really
Exactly.
do.
Exactly.
Can I just ask you this? There's a culture, I think, of mean-spiritedness in our country to this day, which has not embraced part of the issues that they talk about, redressing the past, requiring a whole range of issues, which essentially means looking at our history realistically and realizing we have to address that. I still get a sense that there's a mean-spiritedness.
So the key thing here is, if we're going to make that 2030 vision real, we have to be clear around what is our theory of change around making that happen.
So tell me, what is yours?
And so one of the ideas here is, if this is the world that we want, and it's so beautifully presented here, then that's where we need to focus our attention on, because we know that the human behavior goes where we focus our attention. Now, if we focus our attention in the way that we currently do around the things that are wrong and about the crime, and that's all the media talks about, and that's all we find ourselves being confronted with all the time, that's where our focus of our attention goes. That's what we create more of. And so the invitation here,
how do you change that?
We start to have more conversations around the country around this vision. We convene more that's the leadership job, is to convene the gatherings and say, if this is what we want to create, what can you do? What can you do? What are you going to do today to make that happen? But we're not having that conversation.
I accept
we keep talking about what's wrong in our country today and how it's so horrible and how we're also ashamed of the rape video. Well, let's stop talking about the rape video. Let's talk about what is it that we want to have in the future.
Can I ask you, are we having conversations in the rural areas and other areas about your planning commission? Are people getting together and doing what you guys used to do in the UDF days and the old days, mobilizing?
In many respects, I think we are getting there. I was very impressed at the ZCC when Bishop Lechanyane based his sermon and commended Vision 2030 to that large congregation, and those are amongst the poorest South Africans. I'm encouraged because the message is getting through in the languages that people speak. And whether we have the ability to collect the views back is a big challenge, but it's a mobilization. The big issue, and I want to attach myself to what Louise was just saying. You see, apart from just bad news, one of the difficulties is, in the absence of the sense of accountability to each other, demagoguery thrives.
Yeah.
And one of the big problems, you know, I speak to people who occupy office in organizations, and they will explain to me how difficult it is and ask one to raise issues. But what they lack is the ability to face sometimes angry people and break the bad news to them. And I think that's such a fundamentally important part of leadership. And you can look at how things spin out of control. I mean, and sometimes it's just very poor management. Two very topical issues now would be the Protection of State Information Bill and how to deal with the user pay principles for the users of freeways.
I'd love to talk about that. I'm running out of time, Minister, so I'm going to have to leave it there with you.
I'm saying demagoguery thrives.
I agree with that. I just want to, I mean, let me pick up, by way of conclusion, something that the Minister said whilst we were in the break, which was picked up by Louise as well. If we just look at what, in fact, this National Planning Commission is talking about, it says, who are we? We are Africans. We're an African country. We're part of our multinational region. We are an essential part of the continent. We're Africans. How do we become Africans of an inclusive kind? That's what they're asking us to do. And the panelists are right. It's about time that the media, right across this country, and I issue it as a challenge, let's stop talking necessarily about all the stuff that just creates demagoguery, and let's start talking about how do we implement this vision. Because frankly, if we can implement this vision of 2030, we won't have to talk about all that nonsense, because we'll have the kind of society encapsulated here. How do we get there? Read this report. You may well discover that it has much to say for implementing the kind of vision which is contained in our Constitution. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.